It is complicated. That may be the only three words that all parties can agree on in Syria. Here's what we know. The ceasefire that began at midnight Friday has brought a reduction in hostilities for the first time in the 5-year war. A war that's killed more than 250,000 people, displaced half of Syria's population and flooded Europe and the Middle East with refugees. But with the opposition and Syrian government blaming each other for more than a dozen violations, countries sponsoring the peace process met in Geneva Monday to deal with the charges that the deal is unravelling. Later we'll talk to a Syria-based journalist and a former advisor to the Kremlin. But we begin with CCTV's Natalie Carney, who's monitoring the situation from Istanbul. Natalie, thanks for joining us. What are these alleged violations? Are they true, or is it just finger-pointing?
Well, at this point, there really is a number of different monitoring groups claiming breaches of the violations from both inside Syria and outside Syria. For instance, the Human Observatory, or the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based organization, is saying that warplanes attacked 6 towns in the northern Syrian province of Aleppo early on Sunday morning, just hours after the ceasefire took effect. It also says that there is video purportedly showing plumes of smoke rising above towns in the province of Hama. Now, rebels are saying these warplanes were from Russia, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that an identity of these warplanes is not yet clear. The Syrian High Negotiation Council, this is an umbrella organization that represents many of the rebel factions, has filed a petition to the UN Secretary General claiming that the Syrian government, Russia, Iran, have broken the ceasefire 15 times in the matter of 24 hours. Russia, for its part, is saying that it accuses rebels and jihadis of breaking that ceasefire upwards of 9 times since it went into effect. So that meeting you mentioned that happened in Geneva on Monday is an attempt to try to get both sides to the table and sort of thrash out what actually is happening in Syria right now. One of the big problems is, and where the lines are being blurred in some areas, is the fact that the ceasefire does not apply to areas that have been held by the terrorist organizations ISIL and Al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization operating in the country. So that's one area that could be used as a so-called, let's say, reason why some of these ceasefire breaches are taking effect at the moment. But the hope is that this ceasefire holds largely, despite what Washington is calling potholes, to bring all parties to the table for UN-brokered talks to start up again on March the 9th.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that, because that timeline did slip before and it could slip again. This, of course, is also a humanitarian crisis as well, Natalie. There are reports of starvation. There are reports of cities really not being able to get access to food and medicines. How big is the problem? And given we've just had a few short days, is some aid getting through to the areas and the people that need it most?
Well, this really is a critical time for the United Nations to get aid, to get food, to get medicine, to get blankets even, to the thousands of people that it fears are at risk of starvation in many of these besieged towns and villages across the country. The UN Emergency Relief Arm says that the ceasefire has held well enough to this point for them to dispatch some 50 trucks into the country. They hope to reach around 150,000 people in the next few days, and 1.7 million people at risk by the end of March. That's quite the timeline. They're also looking at attempted airdrops over the eastern city of Deir al-Zor, where about 200,000 people are being besieged by ISIL. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent organization as well has been able to dispatch about 40 trucks into besieged rebel-held areas across the country. But again, how many people will be able to benefit from this humanitarian aid and how far it can get into the country really does depend on Russia, on the U.S., and all parties getting through these breaches, so-called breaches in the ceasefire, and maintaining the ceasefire long enough for that aid to get in.
Some aid getting through, but not enough. Thanks, Natalie. That's CCTV's Natalie Carney reporting from Istanbul. Thanks. And joining us from London is former Russian journalist and Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrasov. And with us here in Washington is Emma Ashford. She's a visiting research fellow with the Cato Institute, focusing on Russian and US foreign policy and the politics of the Middle East. And joining us from Damascus is Syria-based journalist Mohammed Ali. Thanks so much for all of you for joining us. Let's start in Damascus, where obviously, Mohammed Ali, there is a shaky cessation of violence or ceasefire, or whatever you want to call it. Lots of allegations already on both sides about the Syrian government breaking the cessation of violence, the rebels breaking the cessation of violence. Who's right? What's going on?
Well, in fact, according to what Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said just today in an interview with a German TV channel, he said that the militants violated the cessation of hostilities deal since the first hour of its activation, but the Syrian army did not respond to such attack by the militants in a bid to give a chance, actually, to the success of this deal. This is according to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And also, on the first day, as a journalist, we were here in Damascus. I was here, and we saw a couple of mortar shells being fired from militant-held areas in eastern Al-Ghouta, namely Douma and areas like Jobar, towards government-held parts like Al-Abbasiyin. The mortar shell fell in the Al-Abbasiyin square. Now, this is not the only violation that we've heard of. According to the Ministry of Defense, also the Russian Ministry of Defense, about 15 violations by the militants were made in various parts of the country during the past 24 hours in the countryside of Homs, Latakia, and other places. Also in Dar'a, today, 7 mortars were launched by militants from areas they control in Dar'a al-Balad towards areas in government-held areas in Dar'a, also particularly Al-Sabil. Several people were injured.
Emma Ashford, I want to bring you here. There's lots of finger-pointing going on about whether this cessation of violence holds. What do you think is happening here, and do you think it will hold long enough to get to peace talks?
You know, I think we've seen violations of the ceasefire on both sides, and I think we probably expected to see that. So we've seen the Russians held off for a day, but then they've started bombing, and with rebel groups so mixed in with one another, it's very hard to tell if they're hitting legitimate targets or if they're hitting different rebel groups. And then we've definitely seen various groups inside Syria, particularly ones that aren't included in the ceasefire, like al-Nusra, pushing back against the ceasefire. But right now, I'm relatively hopeful that it will continue to hold. It looks like it has held longer than we might have expected. And if it manages to stay in a relatively low hostility situation until the peace talks start up again next week, that would be a big achievement.
Well, we've actually got some news today. Stefan de Mistura, the international envoy for Syria, and I want to bring in you here, Alex from London, have said it's up to the US and Russia to make this work because of all these counterclaims so early that it may not be holding. What can the US and Russia do to make sure this works, considering the mutual suspicion of both Washington and Moscow?
Well, first of all, I think that both sides should not make a drama out of the crisis and actually feel quite satisfied with the fact that this ceasefire, which in itself is a miracle, I'll be honest with you. We have so many sides involved in it that it's a miracle that it's holding even with all the violations. Now, the problem with the Syrian resolution is that all sides tend to appoint deadlines. You know, for example, we have to start those peace talks in exactly that time. And if this ceasefire doesn't hold, well, guess what? We'll probably have to, you know, delay them and so on. Of course, you should be flexible. Both America and Russia should be flexible. If there is a breakdown temporarily, okay, let's delay those peace talks. But those deadlines, they're always causing problems. And I hope both Russian and American diplomats will not stick to this very strict, you know, timetable.
Mohammed Ali in Damascus, the High Negotiating Committee, which is the Saudi-backed collection of various factions, 97 of them actually have signed on to this cessation of violence, have said that they think this cessation of violence will actually help Damascus solidify its gains in and around cities like Aleppo and help the Russians help them too. What's the response there?
Well, the Syrian government is working according to the deal itself, which did not include fighting kind of linked terrorists like the ISIL and al-Nusra Front. What's happening on the ground here is that, yes, the Syrian army continues to fight ISIL and al-Nusra, particularly in areas like southeast of Homs in al-Qaryatain and also east and northeast of Aleppo, where ISIL is heavily present. This is what's happening currently, and the army just a couple of days ago liberated a main and vital road that links Aleppo with Hama all the way to Damascus after killing all of the ISIL terrorists over there. The army is not attacking actually any kind of militant group which has accepted this deal and which is of course affiliated to the Free Syrian Army, or what the West calls as moderate rebels. However, the army is working very carefully to actually honor this deal and keep it active in order to perhaps have any kind of suitable grounds for any peace talks.
Let's bring Emma Ashford in here. Are the warring sides so exhausted with war that they're willing, do you think, to put down their arms? And this pause also helps humanitarian aid in, which could actually help build some sort of trust with populations, do you think? Maybe.
I think the longer that this cessation of hostilities goes on, the better off people inside Syria will be. And there have been some reports that people that were talking about fleeing, particularly Damascus, have actually rethought that and are staying where they are now that humanitarian aid is starting to get into the country. But what we need to see really is more trust on all sides. In particular, the UN has been complaining that the Assad regime is very slow to let aid into the areas that it is still besieging. And if they don't let that happen, then that will undermine trust for negotiations going forward.
And they are trying to coordinate these aid deliveries so each side actually sees the benefit sometimes at the same time. Alex Nekrasov, the US and Moscow have been suspicious of one another, especially since the Russian government decided to intervene in Syria late last year. But they're really kind of working together a little bit here, aren't they, for the first time, in terms of exchanging information about the cessation of hostilities, trying to map where various groups are. Is this the beginning of a Washington-Moscow axis in terms of pushing for peace, or at least some sort of extended ceasefire that can create room for talks?
Well, obviously, there's been a change in the position of Washington, because we don't hear every day the American officials saying that Assad should go tomorrow or even yesterday.
They're not saying that
anymore. So that's, of course, a change.
Yeah.
Yes, but unfortunately, there is one problem. And the problem I see is that although we have basically the ceasefire holding, and most of the groups seem to be abiding by the ceasefire, it's very difficult to contemplate that there's still an official sort of opening to continue the fighting, if you know what I mean. You know, on the one hand, everybody says, okay, we stop fighting, we'll let the humanitarian aid go in. On the other hand, everybody's saying, yes, but we continue to fight the terrorists. And the problem is that both America and Russia have a different view on some of those terrorists.
That's right. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, yes.
Well, that's the problem, you see, and that creates confusion. I would have thought that ideally both America and Russia would have put weight behind the scenes on some of the key players in the region and said to them, look, guys, talk to these people, because you are linked to them. You know, they can talk publicly that nobody supports ISIL or nobody supports al-Nusra Front, but of course they are supported. So behind the scenes, if they could have at least arranged some sort of a deal that these terrorists would also have stopped fighting, then the whole process becomes easier. Now, unfortunately, everyone is accusing each other. The moment a shot is fired, they say, oh, it's been fired against the moderates or something else. So that's, I feel, is the weakness of this process.
Mohammed Ali, I just want to go to you in Damascus, because facts on the ground do shape diplomatic outcomes. And before the cessation of violence, we saw gains from the Syrian government side, especially in and around Aleppo and elsewhere. Do you think, given the advances by Syrian government forces and the fact we have a secession now, that President Assad is now guaranteed of staying in power?
Well, the Syrian president has made it very clear in many interviews throughout the unrest that he made with many media outlets that it's only up to the Syrian people to decide if he should stay or not in power as a Syrian president. Only the elections, according to the Syrian government's point of view, by the Syrians themselves, will determine who stays in power or not. This is a very important point that the Syrian government always notes to, which is it does not want any foreign side to interfere in its affairs, whether a friend or an enemy state or a friendly state. This is a very important fact that the Syrian government has pointed out to. And actually in April, we're expecting to have here parliamentary elections. The Syrian government's political life here continues. This is what the Syrians the Syrian government is always stressing on, that on the one hand, it will continue with the political life in Syria according to the Syrian constitution and laws. And on the other hand, it will continue fighting terrorism while calling for a political solution, calling for reconciliation, calling for dialogue among the Syrians themselves. But Syrian presidents staying in power or not is always noted to here by the Syrian government that it is only up to the Syrian people themselves here in Syria.